Welcome back. I was reviewing this particular script last week, and one detail made me pause. Not the drunk confession, not the tears at the altar, but the timestamp on a single encrypted email sent at 9:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 2 hours before the ceremony. That is the kind of precision that separates cold strategy from blind reaction. You are watching Eternal Diary. The smell of white gardenias had always made Vivian Chen think of funerals. She registered this the moment she stepped into the Meridian Grand's lobby, and the floral installations hit her. Towers of white blooms, thick-stemmed, their petals curling at the edges in the hotel's dry, recycled air. The scent was aggressive, the way expensive things often were, designed to announce itself before anything else could. Vivian breathed through her mouth, adjusted the strap of her overnight bag, and moved through the lobby with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already decided how this weekend would end. That was the first Friday in October. 3 weeks earlier, she had been the maid of honor. She had the group chat receipts to prove it. The shared Pinterest board for centerpiece concepts. Saw the deposit confirmation from the florist in Koreatown, where she and Charlotte had spent an entire Sunday afternoon arguing, gently, pleasantly, the way only genuine friends could argue, about the difference between ivory and cream. Charlotte had wanted ivory. Vivian had said cream was warmer against golden-toned skin. Charlotte had laughed and told her she was overthinking it, and Vivian had laughed back and said that overthinking things was her entire professional identity. They had left with cream gardenias ordered. Now they were ivory. And Vivian was not the maid of honor. She found out the way most modern demotions happened, through a screenshot forwarded by someone who thought they were doing her a favor. A post on Serena Park's private Instagram, since made public because Serena had miscalculated her own audience. Saw a photo of Serena in a bridal boutique, arm linked through Charlotte's, both of them flushed and bright under fitting room light. And the caption, "She said yes to the dress and to her new MOH. Honor doesn't even cover it. Love you forever, Char." Vivian had looked at that photo for a long time, not because she was processing it. She processed it in approximately 4 seconds, but because she was cataloging it. The specific quality of Charlotte's smile in that picture. The way it was slightly wider than her usual photograph smile, slightly more performative. The kind of smile that required an audience and fed on one. Vivian had known Charlotte for 11 years. She could read the taxonomy of her expressions the way a sommelier read a glass of wine. The nose, the body, the finish. That smile said, "I am getting away with something." She had tucked that observation away and said nothing. She texted Charlotte a simple message. "Heard the news? Congrats to you both. See you at the wedding." And Charlotte had replied with 3 heart emojis and the phrase, "You're the best, V. I'll explain everything later." And the explanation never came. Vivian had not expected it to. She understood by then that the explanation was not the point. The point was that Charlotte had already moved on to the next act of her life and expected everyone around her to simply flow into their new positions without friction or complaint. Vivian was very good at appearing frictionless. She checked into her room on the 14th floor, set her bag on the luggage rack, and stood at the window for a moment. Below her, the city moved with its usual indifference. A taxi cutting off a rideshare, a cluster of tourists photographing themselves in front of the hotel entrance, pigeons reorganizing on a ledge. Ordinary things. The world did not care about Vivian Chen's demotion from the wedding party of Charlotte Bay. The world had considerably larger issues. But Vivian cared, not in the way people expected her to care, not with the hot, embarrassing sting of social humiliation, not with the need to call someone and process her feelings over a glass of wine. She cared in the way she cared about everything that mattered, precisely, methodically, and with a view to the longer arc. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop. The document she pulled up was not a wedding itinerary. It was a spreadsheet she had been building over the past 4 months. Each row a transaction, each column a date and an amount and a counterparty. And while the spreadsheet had a tab labeled Lumiere Holdings and another labeled Shell Entities, and a third that she had simply titled, with her characteristic understatement, Notes. The notes were extensive. She closed the laptop after 20 minutes, showered, changed into the navy dress she had selected for the rehearsal dinner, understated, well-cut, the kind of thing you wore when you wanted to be remembered as composed rather than interesting, and went downstairs. The rehearsal dinner was on the rooftop. The Meridian Grand's rooftop was the kind of space that photographed beautifully and existed slightly less beautifully in person, the way most aspirational things did. Strings of Edison bulbs sagged gently between iron posts. Long communal tables draped in white linen held arrangements of pale flowers, ivory, if not cream, and votives in amber glass. The city skyline hung at the edges of the space like a painted backdrop, which was, Vivian thought, an appropriate metaphor for the entire event. She arrived on time, which meant she arrived before the wedding party, which meant she had 12 minutes to stand with a glass of sparkling water and observe the room filling in. She did this without any social discomfort. Observation was her natural state. She cataloged the guests as they arrived. Marcus's business associates, florid-faced men in their 50s who carried themselves with the specific confidence of people who had never once doubted their own worth. Marcus's mother, a small, imperious woman in a steel-gray dress who moved through the crowd like she was conducting it, Charlotte's university friends. Thus a cluster of women in their early 30s who had the slightly haunted look of people who had once known each other very well and were now strangers performing familiarity. Charlotte's co-workers from the years before Lumiere, before the company that Charlotte and Vivian had built together from a shared Google Doc and a $15,000 seed loan and approximately 600 hours of combined labor. And then, at the center of it all, Charlotte. She had always been beautiful in the way certain people were beautiful, not because of any single feature, but because of the total effect. The way every part of her face and body and posture worked in coordination to produce an impression. Tonight she wore a silk slip dress the color of champagne, and her dark hair was pinned up with small gold clips. And she moved through the rooftop with the ease of someone who had been performing for rooms her entire life. She greeted people with two-handed clasps, leaned into brief embraces, laughed at precisely the right moments. She was magnificent, actually. Vivian could acknowledge this without feeling anything complicated about it. What Vivian felt was something closer to clinical interest in when the performance would break. Marcus Holt, the groom, stood near the bar. He was 38, 6'2", with the kind of broad-shouldered ease that came from generations of money rather than from the gym. He was conventionally handsome in a way that aged well. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a smile that he deployed the way politicians deployed theirs, warmly but with precision. He was laughing at something one of his associates was saying, and he had one hand in his trouser pocket and the other wrapped loosely around a glass of scotch, and he looked like a man who had no idea that his entire weekend was going to turn into something else entirely. Vivian felt a brief, unwanted flicker of something for him. Not quite sympathy. More like the particular sadness she sometimes felt watching animals in the second before something startled them. She let it pass. Serena Park arrived 11 minutes after the official start time, which was calculated, Vivian noted this, to ensure maximum visibility. She was wearing red, which was either an act of confidence or an act of aggression toward the bride's aesthetic palette, possibly both. Serena was 29, so Anu, a lifestyle influencer with 2.1 million followers and a personal brand built on the intersection of wellness, fashion, and aspirational femininity. She was the kind of person who described herself as an empath, and meant it in the flattering sense, the way people described themselves as brutally honest, and meant only the brutal. She had Charlotte's arm the moment she reached her, and Charlotte's face opened into something genuinely warm, and Vivian cataloged this too. The warmth Charlotte showed Serena was different from the warmth she showed her other guests. It had a specific quality to it, a slightly desperate edge, the warmth of someone who needed to be seen as having this person in her corner. Charlotte needed Serena's approval. That was interesting. Dinner began. Now Vivian was seated at a table with Charlotte's university friends. A placement that said, more clearly than any words, "You are no longer in the inner circle." She sat beside a woman named Priya who worked in public health and had a dry, observational humor that Vivian found genuinely pleasant. They talked for most of the first course about hospital administration policy. It was the most relaxing conversation Vivian had at the entire event. Across the rooftop, the wedding party table gleamed under the Edison bulbs. Serena sat to Charlotte's left, fulfilling the role that had been Vivian's. She was animated, leaning close to Charlotte to share asides, touching Charlotte's arm at intervals, performing the choreography of best friendship with considerable skill. Vivian watched this the way she watched most things, without visible reaction, with complete attention. The other bridesmaid at that table was a woman named Kayla, one of Charlotte's fitness industry connections, pleasant and uncomplicated, the kind of person who served as social ballast rather than social driver. She laughed at everything Serena said, which suggested she understood the hierarchy of the table she was sitting at. The third person of interest was Derek Yoon. He was seated at a table 2 rows back from the wedding party, business associates section, because he was officially Marcus's CFO and therefore there in a professional adjacent capacity. He was 34, Korean American, narrow-faced, and precise, in the way certain finance people were precise. Everything from his haircut to his collar points suggesting someone who had decided long ago that the details were where authority lived. And he had a glass of white wine that he nursed very slowly and a conversational manner that could best be described as controlled. He did not look at Charlotte very often. This, Vivian had learned, was the tell. People who were managing a secret relationship with someone in a room did not stare. They actively avoided. They calibrated the exact distance of their gaze to land at the person-shaped negative space just to the left or right of the person they were thinking about constantly. Derek Yoon's eyes rested, with great disciplined frequency, on the table just to the left of Charlotte Bay. Vivian had documented this pattern 4 months ago at a Lumiere board dinner, where she had first noticed it. She had not yet known what she was seeing. She had been tracking something else entirely. The company finances, the suspicious outflows, and Derek's controlled gaze had been a data point she had filed without a label. It had taken 6 weeks before she labeled it correctly. Wines were poured. The second course arrived. The speeches started. Marcus's best man was his older brother, a jovial Wall Street type who told a story about Marcus's first apartment and received the room's obligatory laughter with visible satisfaction. Charlotte's father gave a brief, dignified toast about his daughter's capability and ambition, which was the most accurate thing said all evening. Serena was last in the unofficial order, and she stood with a glass of champagne and said all the right things. Loyalty, beauty, and how Charlotte had taught her the meaning of showing up for people. And Charlotte listened with shining eyes. And Vivian thought, you taught Serena how to show up for people by demonstrating, in real time, the exact opposite. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, Serena had refilled her glass several times. Vivian was counting. This was not a specific plan on her part. She had arrived at this weekend with a plan already formed, a plan that had nothing to do with Serena Park's relationship with champagne. But Vivian had a habit, professional and personal both, of tracking variables she hadn't asked to track. She watched Serena's posture shift over the course of 2 hours, from precise to expansive. Watched her voice lose its careful calibration and gain the loose, confident musicality of genuine intoxication. Watched her laugh become larger than its containers. Kayla, the other bridesmaid, was watching too, with the mildly anxious expression of someone who understood that being adjacent to an unraveling person at a social event was its own kind of liability. Vivian refilled her water glass. The formal dinner had dissolved into something looser. Guests migrating toward the bar, toward each other, toward the city view at the railing. Charlotte and Marcus had been swept into separate clusters, the way couples at their own events always were, orbiting each other rather than standing together. Marcus was laughing at something near the bar, his jacket off now, tie loosened, looking genuinely happy in the easy way of people who had no particular reason not to be. Though Charlotte was explaining something to her father's business partner with one hand on his arm and one hand making a small decisive gesture, her natural mode, explaining, persuading, managing. Serena had migrated to the railing with Kayla. Vivian migrated with complete unhurriedness to a position 10 feet away and slightly behind them, near a potted boxwood that gave her a partial screen. She was looking at her phone. She was not looking at her phone. "She's so good," Serena was saying. Her voice had that particular late-night intimacy that alcohol manufactured, the illusion of closeness, the erosion of calculation. Like genuinely, honestly, she holds everything together. This whole thing, the company, Marcus, all of it, she handles it. Kayla made an affirming sound. And I love her. I do love her, Serena continued. Oh, but I also think she's complicated, you know? Like the whole thing with. She paused, took a sip, reformed the sentence. She confides in me, more than she should sometimes, like I know thing. We all know things, Kayla said, lightly, with the tone of someone trying to redirect. No, but like. Serena turned to lean against the railing, facing inward toward the party now, her glass held loosely at her side. Her voice dropped in a way that was intended to be quieter and achieved, in the acoustic particulars of this corner of the rooftop, the opposite effect. She's in love with someone else. She told me. Not like a little crush. Like, she said the word love. She said she's in love with Derek, and she's been for almost a year. Kayla said nothing for a beat. Serena, I know, I shouldn't, but like, tomorrow she's marrying Marcus, and I think she thinks she can keep it compartmentalized, like she thinks they can just continue the way things are. And I have told her, Serena, stop. The snap in Kayla's voice was clean and effective. Serena blinked, looked at her glass. Some remaining instrument of self-preservation reassembled itself behind her eyes. You're right, Serena said. Yeah. I need water. They moved away from the railing. Vivian stood still. The city below her continued with its complete indifference. The Edison bulbs above her swayed slightly in the October wind. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. Marcus's laugh, she identified it without looking. And the sound carried across the rooftop the way certain sounds did, cutting through the ambient noise with their particular frequency. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary. What she felt, she would examine later, in the privacy of her room, with the lights off and the city dark outside the window. What she felt was something she did not have a clean word for. A kind of satisfaction that had grief's texture, but none of grief's paralysis. The confirmation of something she had known but not yet heard spoken aloud. The specific relief of a variable resolving. She knew about Derek. She had known for 8 weeks. She had filed it as secondary information, relevant but secondary to the financial record. The personal betrayal and the professional one had seemed at the time like different stories running on parallel tracks. She was beginning to understand they were the same story. She went back to her room at 11 p.m. She did not cry. She had not cried about Charlotte in 3 months, and before that, the crying had been brief and functional, the kind of emotional processing that served a biological need and did not indicate anything about the depth or permanence of her position. Vivian had long understood that being a person who did not emote visibly was frequently interpreted by people who needed visible emotion as proof of interior life, as evidence that she did not have feelings. This was fine. Misread people made miscalculations. She opened her laptop. She opened the spreadsheet. She opened a second document she had saved under the anodyne title Q4 Client Notes and read through it for 20 minutes, checking her citations, verifying her sequence of events. She then opened a third window and drafted a message she had been composing, and in her head and in rough form for 6 weeks. The message had 4 recipients. The first was the corporate attorney for Holt Development, Marcus's company, a woman named Janet Park, no relation to Serena, who had a reputation in the M&A legal community for being exactly as methodical as her name suggested. The second was the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower via their online tip portal, which she had bookmarked 3 months ago. The third was the email address of a man named Richard Bay, Charlotte's father, who sat on the board of Lumiere Holdings, who had co-signed the original incorporation documents 11 years ago as a favor to his daughter, and who had, as far as Vivian could determine from the financial records, no idea what had been done with his signature. Want to ask the fourth recipient? And this was the one that had required the most thought, was Marcus Holt's personal email address. She had drafted the body of the email 17 times. The final version was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph identified her, explained her role as co-founder and former co-CEO of Lumiere Holdings, and stated that she was writing because she had become aware of information material to Holt Development's pending merger with Lumiere Holdings. The second paragraph provided a concise, specific summary of the financial irregularities she had documented: the transfers, the shell entity, the timeline, with a sentence indicating that full documentation was attached. The third paragraph noted, without elaboration, that the documentary record suggested these transactions had been executed with the knowledge and assistance of Holt Development's own CFO, Derek Yun, and provided a single specific transaction as an example with date, amount, and counterparties identified. The fourth paragraph said only, attachments are encrypted. Password will be provided upon request. This information is accurate to the best of my knowledge and has been verified against source documents. It was 4 paragraphs. It was, by most measures, the most consequential thing she had ever written. She read it once more, changed 2 words, checked the attachments, 18 documents, organized into 4 folders, each folder labeled with a date range and a category. Forensic accounting was, among its other virtues, a discipline that produced excellent documentation. Now, she set the email to send at 9:14 a.m. the following morning, not 9 o'clock, which would be too round, too obviously deliberate, not 8:30, which was too aggressive, too much like a weapon deployed before the target had fully woken. 9:14 a.m. allowed for the wedding morning preparations to have begun, the hair and makeup, and the choreographed getting ready rituals that Charlotte would be in the middle of, which meant she would not be checking email. It allowed Janet Park, Marcus's attorney, to receive the message on a Saturday morning when she would either see it immediately — she was the kind of attorney who checked email on weekends, Vivian was certain of this — or not until later, but either way it would land before the 11:30 a.m. ceremony. It allowed Marcus's personal email to register the notification, the preview line, used the single sentence of subject header, which read Lumiere Holdings, material information regarding pending merger, to land on his phone while he was, in all probability, standing in front of a mirror having his tie adjusted by his best man. 9:14 was the number she had landed on because it felt, to her, like the correct measurement. Not surgical, not theatrical. Precise. She set the alarm, closed the laptop, and turned off the light. She slept well. This was the thing she found most interesting about herself. In the aftermath, she had been waiting for the insomnia, the tossing and turning that the morality of her position might have produced if she had approached it differently. It didn't come. She slept from midnight to 6:30, woke to the particular gray-blue quality of an October morning, and then lay still for 3 minutes, listening to the city sound that filtered through the window. Delivery trucks, a dog, someone's alarm somewhere on a lower floor, before she got up. She had not built this case out of anger. She wanted to be precise about that, even just internally, even with no audience but herself. Anger was a fuel source she had never trusted, because anger burned at uncontrolled temperatures and left residue. She had built this case because it was accurate, and because accuracy, in matters of financial fraud, was a civic obligation as much as a personal one, because 42% of Lumiere Holdings' equity belonged to her, Vivian Chen, which had been diluted on paper, fraudulently diluted, by a series of transactions she had spent 4 months documenting with the same focused patience she brought to every complex problem. Because the merger Charlotte was leveraging her marriage to facilitate would, if completed with the current fraudulent documentation, result in Vivian's equity being absorbed into a structure that would effectively erase her. Because she had given 11 years and $15,000 and 600 hours and an incalculable amount of creative and intellectual labor to something that Charlotte had decided at some point was entirely hers. The anger was in there somewhere, she acknowledged this. The grief too, but they were in the back, behind the glass, informing the work without directing it. She had learned, in law school, in years of forensic accounting practice, in the patient accumulation of professional discipline, that the best work was done cold. She ordered coffee from room service. It arrived at 6:52. The room service coffee, hotel coffee, always slightly wrong in a way she couldn't specifically identify, Too uniform, lacking whatever idiosyncrasy a specific machine and specific hands produced. She drank it standing at the window. The city was doing what the city always did, beginning again without ceremony. At 8:30, she put on the dress she had brought for the wedding. It was green, a deep understated green that she had selected not with any particular intention, but because it was the right dress for the day and she had not allowed the circumstances to disrupt the ordinary care she took with small decisions. It had a clean neckline and a fitted bodice, and it fell to just below the knee. She wore her hair down, straightened slightly, and put on the small gold earrings that she wore on days that required precision. She checked the email. Still in her outbox, scheduled for 9:14. She sat in the armchair by the window and read for 40 minutes. A casebook she had been working through. Administrative law, nothing to do with any of this, but grounding in its specificity, until her phone showed 9:12. She set the casebook down, watched the phone, 9:13, 9:14. The email left her outbox. She felt the exhale happen in her chest before it reached her mouth. Long and steady, the kind of release that was more physiological than emotional, the body's way of marking a transition from effort to its completion. She sat with it for a moment. The quiet of the hotel room, the gray October morning, the smell of second-rate coffee cooling in a white cup. Then she picked up her reading again. The ceremony was at 11:30 in the hotel's formal garden terrace. Vivian arrived at 11:15, found her seat in the third row on the groom's side. She had not been given a preference and had simply sat where the usher directed her and watched the wedding begin its preliminary assembly. Guests settled and resettled the way guests did. The string quartet played something by Vivaldi, which was the kind of choice that gestured at classical taste without committing to originality. The floral arrangements were ivory, and the smell of gardenias was very strong in the enclosed garden space. And Vivian breathed through her mouth. The wedding party entered. Kayla came first in sage green, looking controlled. Serena came second, wearing the same sage green in a slightly more dramatic silhouette, her face composed in a way that could only have been achieved through either a significant act of will or a significant amount of concealer applied over the evidence of a difficult morning. She had the look of someone who had woken up and remembered. Her eyes were steady, fixed on the middle distance, and she walked the aisle with a precision that suggested she was managing something. Charlotte came last, on her father's arm. She was, Vivian admitted to herself, breathtaking. The dress was sculptural. Off-shoulder, silk crepe, the kind of white that absorbed the morning light and gave it back slightly warmer. Her hair was down, which was the opposite of last night, and it fell in soft waves over her collarbone. And the small drop earrings she wore caught the light at intervals like punctuation. She was smiling, genuinely. The full-face smile that her performance smile imitated but could not reproduce. She was walking toward Marcus and looking at him, and for a moment, for a long, quiet moment, Vivian considered the possibility that this was real, that this joy was not performance, that the woman she was watching was capable of genuine feeling even in the context of everything else. She was. Vivian was certain of this. Charlotte was capable of genuine feeling. She was also capable of simultaneous and contradictory genuine feelings. Love for Marcus, love for Derek, the love of someone who had built a company with her best friend, and then systematically dismantled the legal protections that made that friendship an equal partnership. Human beings were capable of all of this at once. Vivian had stopped finding this surprising years ago. She watched Charlotte reach the altar. Marcus took her hands. His face, when Charlotte reached him, was something Vivian had not expected to affect her. It was so open, so uncomplicated. She had prepared for the moment with professional detachment, and she found, holding it, that professional detachment had a ceiling and that Marcus Holt's face in the moment he saw his bride was above that ceiling. He looked at Charlotte like she was the most obvious fact in the world, like loving her was something that had required no decision, like he could not imagine what other use a face had except for looking at this person. Vivian looked at her lap. She thought about the email sitting in Janet Park's inbox. She thought about the attachments. Their 18 documents, the 4 labeled folders with their dates and amounts. She thought about the subject line and the fact that Marcus's personal email would show him a preview. Lumiere Holdings, material information regarding pending merger. and that Marcus was not, despite appearances, a man who left unread messages in his inbox. His assistant had mentioned this at a Lumiere board meeting 6 months ago, as a mild complaint, as evidence of his expectations. He was meticulous. He would have seen it. The officiant began. The ceremony proceeded with the smooth, slightly surreal quality that all formal events achieved when enough effort had been spent on their production. The Vivaldi Quartet had transitioned to something softer. As the October light moved across the terrace in the way that light in gardens did, arriving and withdrawing in intervals, the sky's own attention span. Guests were still. The string of the moment held. It broke at 11:47 a.m. This was not visible to most of the room. What was visible to most of the room was Marcus's phone vibrating, a single vibration, silenced but perceptible to the guests in his immediate proximity, and to Marcus himself, whose right hand was holding Charlotte's left hand and whose left hand was in his pocket, where his phone lived. The vibration produced a fractional pause in his stillness, a single blink, slower than the ones preceding it. His eyes moved briefly to some internal space that was not Charlotte's face, and then returned. And then Vivian watched him make a decision that she identified with absolute clarity. He was going to finish this ceremony. What came after would come after. He looked at Charlotte. He said, when the officiant asked, "I do." His voice was even. His face was mostly steady, except for a quality around the eyes that was not grief exactly, not yet, but the place where grief would eventually live. Vivian recognized it because she had felt it herself. Once, when she had first looked at the spreadsheet and understood what she was seeing, the moment you realized something that could not be unrealized. Charlotte said, "I do," with no hesitation, full-voiced, looking at Marcus with those wide, genuine eyes, and Vivian watched this and thought, she doesn't know yet. The thought arrived without satisfaction. Oh, Charlotte did not know that Janet Park had responded to Vivian's email at 9:47 a.m., Vivian had received the reply on her phone during the processional, a single line. "Ms. Chen, thank you for this information. I am reviewing the attachments now. I will be in touch." Charlotte did not know that Marcus had read the email at 9:52 a.m., which Vivian knew because his read receipt had triggered. She had enabled read receipts on the personal email she had sent him, and that he had not responded, which was its own form of response, the response of someone who was very carefully thinking before they spoke. Charlotte knew nothing of any of this. She was marrying Marcus Holt on a Saturday morning in October with complete and genuine joy, and the document that would reorganize the following weeks of her life was sitting in 4 inboxes. Having arrived with the quietly devastating punctuality of 9:14 a.m. They kissed. The guests applauded. The string quartet began. Vivian applauded with everyone else. The reception was in the hotel ballroom, a large, high-ceilinged room that the hotel had dressed in the same ivory and amber palette as the rest of the weekend. Edison bulbs replaced by proper chandeliers here, the lighting warmer and more formal. The room smelled of food now layered over the gardenias, which was an improvement. Vivian found her table, a beautifully set table for 8, slightly to the back left of the room. Table 11, the table designated for people the hosts were obligated to invite, and preferred to seat at a comfortable distance, and settled in. She ate the first course. It was good. A seared scallop situation with a citrus foam. Oh, the kind of dish that announced itself seriously and delivered. She ate and made conversation with the woman to her left, a corporate recruiter named Dana, who had known Charlotte in college, and had the friendly, frank manner of someone who had long since stopped pretending these events were uncomplicated. Dana said at one point, apropos of very little, "I feel like Charlotte has known exactly what she wanted since she was 19 years old, and I've always been slightly exhausted by it." Vivian said, "That's an accurate observation." They got along well. Marcus was at the head table, to Charlotte's right, fulfilling the requirements of his position with the particular grace of someone who had been raised in rooms like this one, who knew how to inhabit a formal role while carrying something private behind it. Vivian watched him with the same careful attention she had applied all morning. He was performing normally, better than normally. He was performing the way a certain type of man performed under pressure, with the discipline that years of high-stakes business had built, the ability to separate the external role from the interior state and execute them in parallel. She had expected this. She had not expected to find it slightly heartbreaking. She returned her attention to the scallop. Serena had been seated at the head table with the rest of the wedding party to Charlotte's left. She was quiet in a way that she was clearly working to make look like ordinary composure. She ate carefully. She drank water. When she laughed, which was infrequently, it was a smaller laugh than the previous nights, a laugh that had been brought to heel. And Derek Yoon was 3 tables from Vivian's business associates section again, a seat that placed him in perfect sightline to the head table without appearing to. He was eating. He was conversational with the men around him. He looked entirely normal, and this, Vivian thought, was either a testament to his composure or evidence that he didn't know yet either. She thought about the SEC tip portal. She had filed the whistleblower submission 6 weeks ago, well before this weekend, before she had decided on the timing of the email, before she had known about the wedding's utility as a context. The submission had been acknowledged by automated response, and then 3 weeks later by a brief personal email from a case analyst asking for supplementary documentation, which she had provided. Oh, the wheels of regulatory oversight moved at their own pace. She had not timed the wedding to coincide with that process. They were parallel tracks, and what happened at the SEC would happen on the SEC's schedule, independent of whatever this morning had set in motion. She was one piece of a larger mechanism. She had always understood this about herself. The main course arrived, a choice she had pre-selected, the fish, not the beef, and it was executed with the practiced competence of hotel catering at a certain price point, which meant it was technically correct and slightly soulless. She ate it anyway, and the conversation at table 11 moved through the usual subjects: work, children, all the oblique assessments of other people's life choices that constitute most wedding table conversation. And she participated with her usual measured engagement, the version of herself that was sociable enough to go unnoticed and reserved enough to make no particular impression. At 2:47 p.m., Marcus excused himself from the head table. Charlotte watched him go, a brief tracking movement of her eyes, and then returned to the conversation she was having with her grandmother. The best man, Marcus's brother, leaned over and made some remark that generated laughter at the head table. The ballroom continued. Marcus did not return for 14 minutes. When he did, his face had changed in a way that was specific and legible to anyone who was watching carefully. The performance was slightly tighter now. The eyes slightly brighter in the particular way of someone who had recently dealt with a physical shock. The light was in them differently. The pupils slightly dilated, the blink rate marginally increased. He sat down. He touched Charlotte's hand. He smiled when she turned to him, and the smile was a good smile, a skilled smile, the smile of someone who had decided that this was not the time and place and that the time and place would come. Vivian thought, he made a call. In the 14 minutes he was gone, he called someone. Janet Park, probably, or his brother, but his brother was still at the head table, so not his brother. Janet Park, or another attorney, or a trusted advisor of some kind. He needed to hear a professional voice confirm that what he had read was real and that he had options. Well, she knew this because it was what she would have done. The afternoon proceeded. Toasts were made. The best man's toast was longer than necessary and featured a running joke about Marcus's golf game that landed unevenly. Serena's toast, when it came, was a different kind of performance from the previous nights. It was careful and warm, a toast that had been rewritten in her head over the course of a difficult morning and came out polished in the way that emergency rewrites were polished. Technically sound, emotionally distant, the way a building looked after the scaffolding was removed, but before the interior was finished. She said all the correct things about Charlotte, her loyalty, her vision, her capacity for love, and Charlotte listened with shining eyes and reached up to squeeze Serena's hand when she finished. Again, Serena squeezed back and then sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone lowering themselves onto uncertain ground. The first dance was The Way You Look Tonight, which was a predictable choice that was, in the execution of it, still capable of doing what it had always done. Marcus held Charlotte with the specific quality of someone who was holding something he knew he might have to let go of. Charlotte had her cheek against his chest and her eyes closed, and she was smiling in a way that Vivian could not fully interpret from her vantage point, which was perhaps the first moment of the entire weekend where her read of Charlotte had a gap in it. She sat with the gap, did not try to fill it. She drank her coffee. Proper coffee now. The dinner service had brought it, and watched the first dance complete, and watched the floor open for general dancing, and watched the afternoon become evening in the way hotel ballrooms shifted, the light warming and the energy loosening, and the formal architecture of the event giving way to something more genuinely social and therefore more genuinely human. At 5:15, her phone rang. She excused herself from table 11, Dana was in conversation, didn't notice, and stepped out through a side door into a corridor that ran along the hotel's service side, fluorescent lit and quiet, smelling of food and cleaning product, the honest infrastructure behind the constructed experience. The number on her phone was Janet Parks. "Ms. Chen," Janet said. No preamble. She had the crisp, slightly formal manner of someone who was accustomed to delivering and receiving significant information in professional contexts, and had designed her entire communication style around that function. "I've reviewed the documentation you sent. I want to be direct with you. Please. The financial record you've assembled is detailed, and it is, if accurate, and I have no reason at this stage to doubt its accuracy, extremely significant. The transactions you've identified, if they occurred as documented, represent potential securities fraud in the context of the pending merger, as well as potential breach of fiduciary duty and possible embezzlement from Lumiere Holdings." A brief pause. "Oh, you co-own 42% of Lumiere Holdings." "Correct. And you have the original incorporation documentation." "I have it." "Then I want to ask you directly. Are you prepared to cooperate with any investigation that follows from this disclosure, including potential civil litigation and regulatory proceedings?" Vivian leaned against the corridor wall. Through the service door somewhere to her right, she could hear the muffled thump of the reception's DJ beginning to operate, a bass note that traveled through the structure of the building and arrived in this fluorescent corridor as something faint and somewhat absurd. "Yes," she said, "there's something else." Janet's voice shifted. Still professional, but with a new quality in it, something that was not quite personal, but was not entirely impersonal either. "Mr. Holt spoke with me earlier. He indicated that he intends to proceed tonight and deal with the situation in the coming days. He asked me to convey to you, and I recognize this is an unusual communication, that he considers the information you provided to be an act of integrity, and that he will be in contact with you next week through proper channels." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That's generous of him," she said. "It may be accurate," Janet said, which was, Vivian noted, exactly the right response. "I'll be in touch Monday morning. Have a good evening, Ms. Chen." The call ended. She stayed in the corridor for another 3 minutes. The bass from the DJ continued its muffled work through the walls. She thought about Marcus Holt on the dance floor on the other side of this wall, holding his wife, and smiling his politician's smile over her shoulder, carrying the knowledge of what this night was the last night of. She thought about Derek Yoon, who did not know yet what was coming. Who would know, she estimated, within the next 48 to 72 hours, once Janet Park had initiated the process of separating him from his role and his access to Holt Development's financial systems with the speed that competent attorneys moved when money was at stake. She thought about Charlotte. Charlotte, who had spent 11 years becoming the most capable person in any room she entered, who had taken $15,000 and an idea and built a company that was, by most measures, a success. A genuine success. Product and market and execution all aligned. Who had, at some point in the last several years, decided that success at that scale was still not enough, that the equity split was still not in her favor, that the partnership was a constraint rather than a foundation. Who had made a series of decisions that were brilliant in their execution and catastrophic in their morality, and who was, right now, on the other side of a hotel wall, dancing at her own wedding, unaware that the architecture of what she had built was already, grain by grain, beginning its adjustment. Vivian felt the grief then. Let it come fully in this fluorescent corridor that smelled of cleaning product and hotel food, and nothing of gardenias. Felt it in the chest, where grief always lived, the specific weight of it, the fact that grieving Charlotte was not the same as forgiving her and never would be, but that they were both things she was doing simultaneously, as humans did. She stood with it for a minute, then she straightened up, put her phone in her bag, and walked back through the door into the warm, loud, champagne-soaked event on the other side. She stayed until 9. This was deliberate. Leaving early would have been a statement, and Vivian had already made the only statement she intended to make. The rest of the evening she navigated with the specific pleasantness of someone who had nothing to prove, which was the most relaxing social state available. She had a genuine conversation with Marcus's mother, who was sharp and funny in the way of women who had grown up in rooms where they were underestimated and had spent decades converting that underestimation into information. They talked about real estate, and then, unexpectedly, about opera. And Marcus's mother said something about Callus that was precise and slightly controversial, and Vivian revised her initial assessment of the woman upward by a considerable margin. She danced twice. Once with a man from table 11 who asked with the nervous politeness of someone who had been working up to it, and once with Dana, who requested it with the directness of someone who did not wait to be asked, and who turned out to be an excellent dancer, light and responsive, moving with the music rather than managing it. She watched Serena, who had navigated the afternoon by essentially never being alone. There was a quality to her social movement that was almost mathematical. She was always within an arm's reach of someone, never in a corner, never in a position where someone could pull her aside for a pointed conversation. She was managing her situation with the focused anxiety of someone who understood she had done something she could not undo and was determining hour by hour whether anyone had heard it. She had not established whether Vivian had heard it. Vivian knew this because Serena had not looked at her with any specific quality, had not sought her out, had not done any of the things a person did when they were managing a known witness to something, which meant Serena had not identified Vivian as a variable. This was fine. It didn't matter either way. What Serena had said at the railing last night had been a confirmation of something Vivian already knew and had already documented. The drunk confession was not the weapon. The weapon was the 18 documents in 4 labeled folders, the product of 4 months of methodical patient work. I was sent at 9:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in October. Serena's role in this story was entirely accidental. At 8:50, Vivian said goodnight to Dana, thanked Table 11 collectively for the conversation, and moved toward the exit with the unhurried ease of someone leaving because she was ready, not because she was retreating. Charlotte caught her at the door. This was not expected. Or rather, Vivian had considered the possibility and had assigned it a low probability. She had underestimated Charlotte's awareness of her own social geometry. Charlotte tracked who was in a room with her always. It was one of her foundational capabilities. The moment Vivian moved toward the exit, Charlotte had registered it. She appeared at Vivian's elbow with the champagne-warm ease of a woman in the middle of her own wedding reception, and her heels in her hand palmed now, the formal architecture of the day loosened, her hair slightly less composed than the ceremony. She looked, objectively, more beautiful now than she had all day. The way people looked when the formal event was over and they could simply be a person in a room. "You're leaving," Charlotte said. Not an accusation, an observation with something underneath it. "Early flight tomorrow," Vivian said, which was true. Charlotte looked at her for a moment. Then she did something Vivian had not anticipated. She reached out and took Vivian's hand. Both hands, the way she had at the rehearsal dinner when greeting other people. The two-handed clasp that was her most genuine form of touch. And she held them, and she looked at Vivian with an expression that Vivian had not seen on her face in years. And it was the expression of someone who knew. Not the financial record. She couldn't know that yet. Not the email, not Janet Park, not any of the specific mechanics. But something. The specific knowledge that Vivian possessed. That Vivian was not simply a demoted bridesmaid saying an early goodnight. It was in the quality of her grip, the particular steadiness of her gaze. "I owe you a conversation," Charlotte said. "Several," Vivian said. Her voice was even. She had prepared for many versions of this moment, and none of them, she recognized, had fully accounted for Charlotte's hands in hers, and Charlotte's eyes being exactly this honest. Charlotte nodded once. "I know." A beat of silence between them that had 11 years in it. "Congratulations," Vivian said, and meant it, in the same complicated way she meant most things. Genuinely. "Oh, he's a good man." Something crossed Charlotte's face that she didn't manage quickly enough. It was the expression of someone who had just heard an assessment they agreed with too strongly to suppress the response. Her eyes held it for a second. The complicated recognition that Marcus was, in fact, a good man, and that this was a fact that complicated everything rather than resolving it. "He is," Charlotte said. Her hands released Vivian's. The moment closed. "I'll call you," Charlotte said. "I know," Vivian said. She walked out through the lobby and into the October night. The air outside was cold and honest, the way air outside hotel lobbies always was, stripped of everything artificial. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the noise of the city arriving around her, a cab, someone's music from a passing car, two people arguing comfortably in Spanish at the corner, and breathed it in. The city smelled like itself. Cold concrete, exhaust, the ghost of someone's dinner in the air. No gardenias. She hailed a cab. The call from Charlotte came 9 days later. Vivian was at her desk when it came, which was where she was most mornings, which was where she was most comfortable. The desk by the window in her apartment, the window that looked out over the street, that was not impressive but was specific, which she preferred. She had a cup of actual good coffee from her own machine, and the casebook was open, though she had been reading the same page for 20 minutes because she had been thinking about the Lumiere board meeting that was scheduled for the following week and the specific order of events that meeting would need to follow. Janet Park had been in contact on Monday, as promised. The conversation had been professional and expedient. The merger was suspended, pending review, which was the formal language for what would turn out to be a more significant unraveling. Derek Yoon had been placed on administrative leave from Holt Development the previous Thursday, which Vivian had learned from a brief news item in a business publication that had somehow gotten the story as a 3-line notice. The SEC had sent a follow-up request for additional documentation on Tuesday, which she had provided through the attorney she had retained, a forensic litigation specialist named Gordon, who was expensive and direct, and had told her in their first meeting, "Yes, you have built a very good case," which was the kind of professional validation that felt differently from personal validation, cleaner, more structural, more durable. Charlotte's number appeared on her phone, and Vivian let it ring twice before answering. "V?" Charlotte's voice was not what she had expected. It was quiet. Not the theatrical quietness of someone managing a scene, but the small, stripped quietness of someone who had been in a particular kind of room. The kind of room where things were explained to you formally, where lawyers sat across tables from you, where the language of official process replaced the language of daily life, and had come out the other side without the performance left. "Charlotte," Vivian said. "I assume you know why I'm calling?" "I have some idea." A breath on the other end. Some of the quality of a window being held open while someone decided whether to go through it. "Did you know about Derek?" Charlotte asked. "Or was it the money that led you to him, or was it the other way?" It was a precise question. Vivian respected it. "The money," she said. "I was tracking the transactions, and he appeared in the record. And then you put the rest together?" "Yes." Another breath. When Charlotte spoke again, her voice had a quality in it that Vivian had last heard years ago, when Charlotte's father had had a health scare, and Charlotte had called her at 11 p.m., and they had talked for 2 hours. The voice of Charlotte without the performance on. It was slightly lower, slightly rougher at the edges, entirely unmagnified. "How long?" Charlotte asked. "Oh, with the money." 4 months. And you waited. "I was building the record." "You were building the record?" Charlotte repeated. Not a challenge. A recognition. The tone of someone who was a builder herself and understood what that meant. "You could have come to me." "I could have," Vivian said. She did not say, "And you would have managed the conversation and managed me and found a way to neutralize the information before it reached anyone who could act on it, and then you would have adjusted the record and I would have nothing." She did not say this because it was unnecessary. Charlotte was smart enough to know it was the reason. "I could have," Vivian said again. "I made a different decision." The silence between them was full of things that neither of them would say, which was, Vivian thought, the only kind of silence that mattered. Of course, the silence of the known things held. "The company," Charlotte said. "What happens to Lumiere?" "That depends on several things." Vivian had discussed this with Gordon. There are legal scenarios where the fraudulent transactions are unwound and equity is restored. There are scenarios involving buyout. There are scenarios where the company winds down. It depends on what the board decides to do with the record and what the SEC process produces and what the civil litigation looks like. Marcus is suing. I know. Are you? My attorney is evaluating it. This was true and was also a way of not answering, which Charlotte recognized and did not push on. God, Charlotte said, quietly, without a drama. The word of someone looking at something large and honestly processing it. Vivian waited. I want you to know, Charlotte said, that what I did to the company was not... It wasn't because I wanted to cut you out. Specifically, it wasn't personal. I know, Vivian said. This was also true. What Charlotte had done had not been personal in the way that most people used that word. It had been strategic, and Vivian had been a casualty of the strategy rather than the target of it. The distinction was, in practical terms, meaningless. But it was accurate, and Vivian valued accuracy even when it was uncomfortable. That probably doesn't make it better, Charlotte said. It doesn't make it worse, Vivian said. A beat, then something that might have been the most unlikely thing in the conversation. A sound that was almost a laugh from Charlotte. Brief and complicated and entirely genuine. You're going to be fine, Charlotte said. It was not a statement of comfort. It was an assessment. The tone of someone who had competed with a person for long enough to understand their capabilities. Yes, Vivian said. I know. Charlotte's voice was steady. That's the thing. I always knew. I just thought I'd be fine first. The line held one more moment between them. Then Charlotte said, I'll have my attorney contact Gordon next week. And Vivian said, That's appropriate? And the call ended. Vivian set the phone down on her desk, picked up her coffee, turned to look at the street out the window, the ordinary street, the ordinary morning, a woman walking a dog that was stopping to investigate something at a lamppost with its full attention. The casebook was still open to the same page. She read it. The Lumiere board meeting happened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the wedding. And it was held in the offices of Morrow and Associates, the firm that managed the board's legal affairs, which was a neutral territory all parties could agree to. Charlotte and her attorney on one side, Vivian and Gordon on the other, Richard Bay in the middle, which was where he had been for 11 years without entirely understanding what the middle required. Richard Bay was 63, with Charlotte's precise cheekbones and a manner that was more measured and less magnetic, the father version of the daughter's qualities rather than their equal. He sat at the table in a dark suit and read the summary document that Morrow's associates had prepared with the careful attention of someone who was reading it for the 4th time and still finding new things in it to dislike. Vivian had been told by a mutual acquaintance, had been very quiet since he had received her email 3 weeks ago. Not angry, not defensive, quiet in the way of someone recalibrating. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. The terms that emerged from it were not simple and not quick. They were the beginning of a legal process that would take, Gordon estimated, somewhere between 14 and 22 months to fully resolve. But within those 3 hours and 20 minutes, several things were established. That the fraudulent transactions would be formally contested, that Charlotte's current equity stake was frozen pending investigation, that Vivian's 42% would be restored to full standing while the process proceeded, and that the merger with Holt Development was formally dead. Derek Yoon was not in the room. He was, Gordon's sources had indicated, in the process of retaining criminal defense counsel, which was its own separate story with its own timeline, not Vivian's to manage. Charlotte sat across the table for 3 hours and 20 minutes with her attorney beside her and said very little, which was unlike her. She had the quality of someone who had assessed the situation and understood that the situation had already been assessed by someone better prepared and that the correct strategy now was to minimize. She was good at this, at knowing when to go quiet, at identifying the moment when forward motion became exposure. Vivian watched her across the table and thought, this is the thing I would have taken longest to learn. The pause, the willingness to be still when movement is the worst choice. She had learned it earlier. When the meeting adjourned, they gathered their materials with the formal efficiency of people who had been in legal environments long enough to know that the way you handled the ending of a difficult meeting was part of the record. Gordon held the door. Charlotte's attorney moved through first. Charlotte moved through second and paused in the doorway and looked at Vivian with the expression that Vivian had no clean name for. Not regret exactly, not apology, not acknowledgement, but something that incorporated all three and was larger than any of them. Vivian held the door. Charlotte nodded once. She walked through. Vivian let the door close. Outside, the October that had been almost autumn when this all began had become fully November. The trees stripped, the sky that low-metal gray that November specialized in, the cold a real cold now, rather than a suggestion of it. Gordon said something about next steps, and about the timeline, about a filing date. And Vivian listened and agreed and registered everything correctly. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The simultaneous functioning of multiple attentions, the professional and the personal, running in parallel without the one contaminating the other. She flagged a cab, sat in it. The city moved past the windows in its usual dense, indifferent way. The traffic, the scaffolding, the people who had their own complete lives full of their own particular complications, none of which included Vivian Chen or Charlotte Bay or Lumiere Holdings, or the specific way a friendship of 11 years could be both real and also ultimately hit a structure that one person had been more willing to protect than the other. Her phone showed a text from Gordon. "Good meeting. I'll call tomorrow." She replied, "Understood." She watched the city. At a red light, a food cart on the corner was doing steady business. A man in a heavy jacket handing over foil-wrapped things to a short queue of people, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years and had the economy of motion to show for it. The light changed. The cab moved. She thought about the spreadsheet, which she would not need to maintain much longer now that it had been formally entered into legal process, where other people's spreadsheets would take over. She thought about the email she had sent at 9:14 a.m. on a Saturday morning in October, and how the precision of that time had felt right in a way she could not fully rationalize and did not need to. She thought about the smell of gardenias, and how she might, in time, be able to dissociate it from the feeling of this weekend, or she might not, and either way it was just a smell. She thought about Marcus Holt's face at the altar. She thought about the woman walking the dog past the lamppost, that specific complete attention the dog had given to whatever was there. She thought about Charlotte saying, "I always knew. I just thought I'd be fine first." And she thought about herself, saying plainly without a performance, "Yes." The cab arrived at her building. She paid and got out, and the cold hit her cleanly. The November cold, the kind that was past negotiation. And she walked to her door and took her keys from her bag and let herself in. Upstairs, her desk waited. The casebook, the coffee machine that made coffee correctly, the window that looked out over the street. She hung up her coat. She opened her laptop. She opened a new document and typed at the top of the first clean page in plain text, with no bold and no headers and no formatting whatsoever. Lumiere Holdings, post-meeting notes, November. She began.